Think cowboys on cattle drives enjoyed sweet treats and delicious desserts after a long day? The reality was that trail desserts were barely edible concoctions made from whatever the chuckwagon carried. These weren't treats or indulgences. They were desperate attempts to add sweetness to a diet that was monotonous, nutritionally inadequate, and soul-crushingly boring. Their struggle wasn't about enjoying dessert, it was about choking down something vaguely sweet that made the endless beans and salt pork slightly more bearable. And it all started with one brutal truth. Sugar was expensive, fresh fruit didn't exist on the trail, and cowboys ate what the cook could make from almost nothing. Sourdough biscuits with sorghum molasses was the most common dessert on cattle drives, and calling it dessert is generous. These were the same hard, dense biscuits cowboys ate with every meal, just with molasses drizzled on top. The biscuits were barely sweet, and the molasses was thick dark and had a bitter edge that made your face contort. Sorghum molasses wasn't like the refined molasses you might buy today. It was crude, unprocessed syrup made from sorghum cane. The flavor was intensely strong, almost medicinal, with a bitterness that lingered in your mouth long after you finished eating. The biscuits themselves were called sinkers because they'd sink to the bottom of your stomach and sit there like rocks. They were made from flour, sourdough starter, salt, and lard. No sugar, no milk, no butter. Just the basics mixed together and baked in a Dutch oven over a campfire. Cookie, the chuckwagon cook, would make these biscuits 3 times a day. By evening, cowboys were so sick of biscuits that even adding molasses didn't make them appealing. But it was the only sweet thing available, so cowboys would eat them and pretend they were having dessert. The molasses would soak into the dense biscuit, making it slightly softer but also making it fall apart in your hands. You'd end up with sticky fingers and molasses dripping down your chin. There was no dignified way to eat this dessert. Young cowboys on their first cattle drive would sometimes complain about the biscuits and molasses. Experienced cowboys would tell them to shut up and eat because it was better than nothing. And they were right, it was better than nothing, but not by much. But at least biscuits and molasses used ingredients that were actually meant to be food. Some trail desserts used whatever was available, regardless of whether it made sense. Vinegar pie was what happened when cowboys wanted pie but had no fruit. This wasn't a joke or an exaggeration. Cooks actually made pies using vinegar, sugar, eggs, and flour. The result was a tart custard-like filling that tasted like sweetened vinegar, because that's exactly what it was. The concept sounds insane, and eating it confirmed that insanity. The filling was intensely sour with an artificial sweetness that didn't quite mask the vinegar taste. Your mouth would pucker with every bite, and the aftertaste was unpleasant and lingering. The crust was the same biscuit dough used for everything else, rolled thin and baked in a Dutch oven. It was tough and chewy, nothing like a proper pie crust, but it held the vinegar filling, which was its only job. The recipe was simple. Mix vinegar, sugar, eggs, and a little flour. Pour it into a crust and bake. The eggs would set the filling into a custard-like consistency. The sugar would fight the vinegar's sourness. The result was edible but not enjoyable. Cowboys would eat vinegar pie and try to convince themselves it was good. Some would claim to like it, but they were lying to themselves and everyone else. Nobody actually liked vinegar pie. They just ate it because it was different from biscuits and beans. The name itself was honest, which was rare for trail food. It was called vinegar pie because it tasted like vinegar. There was no attempt to make it sound appealing or disguise what it was. But vinegar pie at least had a crust and some structure. Other trail desserts were just mush with sugar. Spotted pup was rice pudding, but calling it pudding is generous. It was rice boiled with water, sugar, and raisins until it became a thick, gluey mass. The raisins looked like spots in the white rice, hence the name spotted pup. Cowboys thought this was clever. It wasn't. The texture was the worst part. The rice would be overcooked and mushy, breaking down into a paste-like consistency. The raisins would be hard little nuggets scattered throughout the mush. Eating it felt like chewing wallpaper paste with occasional hard bits. The flavor was bland with occasional bursts of sweetness from the raisins. The rice itself had no flavor beyond starch. The sugar would dissolve into the water, creating a vaguely sweet liquid that soaked into the rice. Cooks made spotted pup when they had rice and raisins, which wasn't often, so spotted pup was actually a special occasion dessert, which is depressing. The name was supposed to be endearing, making the dish sound cute and appealing. But cowboys weren't fooled. They knew they were eating overcooked rice with raisins, and no cute name would change that fact. The dish would be served warm in tin cups or bowls. Cowboys would eat it quickly before it cooled and became even more unappetizing. Cold spotted pup was somehow worse than warm spotted pup. Young cowboys would sometimes refuse to eat spotted pup, claiming it looked like something that had already been eaten once. Older cowboys would force them to eat it anyway, explaining that wasting food on the trail was unacceptable. Speaking of disguising things as dessert, some trail treats were literally just dough fried in grease. Bear sign was fried dough, and it was considered a special treat on cattle drives. This tells you everything about how low the bar was for trail desserts. Take biscuit dough, fry it in lard, and maybe dust it with sugar. If you had any, that was bear sign, and cowboys would get excited about it. The name came from the fact that the fried dough supposedly resembled bear droppings. Cowboys thought this was hilarious. They were eating something that looked like animal feces and calling it a treat. The frontier had a dark sense of humor. The dough was the same sourdough biscuit dough used for everything else. Cookie would pinch off pieces, flatten them slightly, and drop them into hot lard. The dough would puff up and turn golden brown, creating something that resembled a donut but tasted nothing like one. The texture was greasy and heavy. The lard would soak into the dough, making it dense and oily. Eating bear sign meant getting grease all over your hands and face. There was no avoiding it. The flavor was mostly just fried dough with a hint of sourdough tang. If the cook had sugar, he'd dust the bear sign while it was still hot. But sugar was expensive, so most bear sign was just fried dough, with no sweetness at all. Cowboys would eat bear sign hot, straight from the Dutch oven. They'd burn their mouths on the hot grease but didn't care because it was different from the usual fare. Novelty was valuable on the trail. Making bear sign required having enough lard to spare for frying, which wasn't always the case. So bear sign only appeared when supplies were good and the cook was feeling generous. But at least bear sign was fried and had some texture variation. Other trail desserts were just dense, heavy masses that sat in your stomach like lead. Molasses cake was exactly what it sounds like. A dense, heavy cake sweetened with molasses instead of sugar. This wasn't light, fluffy cake. This was a brick of flour, molasses, and lard that could survive in a saddlebag for days without spoiling. The texture was dense and crumbly. The cake would be dry and heavy, requiring significant chewing to break down. It would stick to the roof of your mouth and absorb all moisture, leaving you desperately needing water. The flavor was dominated by molasses, which meant it was intensely sweet with that characteristic bitter edge. There was no subtlety or complexity. It just tasted like molasses in solid form. Cooks would bake molasses cake in a Dutch oven when they had time and ingredients. The cake would be cut into squares and stored in the chuckwagon. Cowboys could grab a piece when they wanted something sweet. The cake would get harder as it aged, eventually becoming almost rock-like. Cowboys would dunk it in coffee to soften it enough to eat. The coffee would soak into the cake, creating a soggy mess that was somehow worse than the dry cake. The cake's durability was its main selling point. You could carry molasses cake in your saddlebag for a week, and it would still be edible. It might be hard as a rock, but it wouldn't spoil. Speaking of things that barely qualified as dessert, some trail treats were just dried fruit that had been sitting in the chuckwagon for months. Dried apple pie was made from dried apples that had been reconstituted in water. These weren't fresh apples that had been recently dried. These were apples that had been dried months ago, transported hundreds of miles, and stored in less than ideal conditions. The dried apples would be soaked in water overnight to rehydrate them. They'd absorb water and swell up, but they'd never return to their original texture. They'd remain tough and chewy, with a concentrated apple flavor that was more intense than fresh apples, but not in a good way. The cook would add sugar to the rehydrated apples and cook them into a filling. The sugar would help mask the fact that the apples were old. The filling would be thick and brown, looking more like mud than fruit. The crust was the same tough biscuit dough used for everything else. The whole thing would be baked over coals until the crust was hard and the filling was bubbling. The result was called apple pie, but it bore little resemblance. To what we think of as apple pie today, the crust was tough and chewy. The filling was brown and mushy. The flavor was vaguely apple-like with an overwhelming sweetness. Cowboys would eat dried apple pie and remember what real apple pie tasted like back home. The comparison would make them sad, but they'd eat it anyway because it was different from biscuits and beans. The pie was sometimes called funeral pie because it could be made without fresh ingredients and would keep for days without refrigeration. The name was morbid but accurate. But dried apple pie at least used fruit. Even if it was old and leathery, some trail desserts used ingredients that had no business being in dessert at all. Son of a gun in a sack was a boiled pudding made with suet, dried fruit, flour, and molasses. The name was a cleaned-up version of what Cowboys actually called it. The pudding was mixed together, wrapped in a cloth sack, and boiled for hours until it became a dense, heavy mass. Suet is the hard fat from around animal kidneys. Using it in dessert sounds disgusting, and eating it confirmed that assessment. The suet would melt during cooking, creating pockets of fat throughout the pudding. Biting into these fat pockets was an unpleasant surprise every time. The dried fruit, usually raisins, provided occasional sweetness in the otherwise bland, fatty pudding. The flour held everything together. The molasses added sweetness and a dark color. The pudding would be boiled in a cloth sack for 3 to 4 hours. When done, the sack would be removed and the pudding would be sliced like a loaf of bread. The texture was dense and greasy. The sweat made everything slippery and left a coating of fat in your mouth. The flavor was sweet from the molasses and raisins, but the sweet added a meaty, fatty taste that didn't belong in dessert. Making son of a gun in a sack required having sweet, which meant an animal had been butchered recently. This made it a special occasion dessert, though calling it special is generous. Some cowboys refused to eat son of a gun in a sack, claiming that suet had no place in dessert. They were right, but they were also hungry, so most eventually gave in and ate it anyway. Speaking of things that shouldn't be dessert, some trail treats were just leftovers repurposed with sugar. Bread pudding was what happened when biscuits got too hard to eat normally. Instead of throwing them away, the cook would break them up, soak them in water, add sugar and maybe some raisins, and bake the whole mess into something resembling pudding. The base was stale, rock-hard biscuits that had been sitting in the chuckwagon for days. These biscuits were inedible in their original form, but waste was unacceptable on the trail, so they had to be used somehow. The biscuits would be broken into chunks and placed in a Dutch oven. Water would be poured over them to soften them. Sugar would be added, along with raisins if available. The mixture would be stirred together and baked until it set into a pudding-like consistency. The texture was mushy and uneven. Some parts would be completely dissolved into paste. Other parts would remain as hard chunks. Eating it meant encountering both extremes in every bite. The flavor was dominated by whatever the biscuits had absorbed during their time in the chuckwagon. Adding sugar didn't completely mask these flavors. Cowboys would eat bread pudding and try to focus on the sweetness rather than the underlying flavors of old biscuits. This required significant mental effort and usually failed. But at least bread pudding used ingredients that were meant to be eaten. Some trail desserts were just whatever the cook could fry. Fried pies were hand pies made with dried fruit filling and fried in lard. These were portable desserts that could be carried in saddlebags and eaten while riding. The portability was their main advantage because the taste was mediocre at best. The dough was the same. Biscuit dough used for everything else. It would be rolled thin, cut into circles, and filled with reconstituted dried fruit. The most common filling was dried apples. The dried fruit would be cooked with sugar until it became a thick paste. This paste would be spooned onto one half of the dough circle, the other half would be folded over, and the edges would be crimped to seal in the filling. The pies would be fried in hot lard until golden brown. The dough would puff up slightly and become crispy on the outside while remaining chewy inside. The result was a handheld pie that was greasy, sweet, and portable. Cowboys could grab a fried pie and eat it while riding, which made it more convenient than other desserts. The grease from frying would soak through the dough, making the pies messy to eat. Your hands would be covered in lard after eating a fried pie. The filling would be extremely hot when the pies were first fried. Biting into a fresh fried pie meant burning your mouth on molten fruit filling. Cowboys learned to let them cool slightly, but impatience often led to burned mouths. Speaking of barely edible sweets, some trail desserts were just sugar boiled until hard. Sorghum candy was made by boiling sorghum molasses until it reached the hard crack stage, then pulling it like taffy while it cooled. The result was a hard candy that tasted like concentrated molasses with all the bitterness that implied. Making sorghum candy required time and attention that cooks rarely had. The molasses had to be boiled to exactly the right temperature. Too low and it wouldn't harden. Too high and it would burn. Once the molasses reached the right temperature, it would be poured onto a greased surface to cool slightly. When it was cool enough to handle but still pliable, the cook would grease his hands and begin pulling the candy. Pulling candy meant stretching it, folding it back on itself, and stretching it again repeatedly. This incorporated air into the candy and changed its texture. The process was labor-intensive and required strong hands. The pulled candy would be stretched into long ropes, then cut into pieces. The pieces would harden as they cooled completely, creating hard candies that could be sucked on or chewed. The flavor was intensely sweet with that characteristic molasses bitterness. The candy would stick to your teeth and take forever to dissolve. Eating sorghum candy meant having a sticky, bitter taste in your mouth for an extended period. Cowboys would receive a piece or two of sorghum candy as a special treat. They'd make it last as long as possible because they knew it would be a long time before they had candy again. Making candy required having enough molasses to spare, which wasn't always the case, so sorghum candy only appeared on special occasions or when supplies were abundant. But the simplest trail dessert required no cooking at all, just rehydrating dried fruit and hoping for the best. Stewed dried fruit was exactly what it sounds like. Dried fruit cooked in water with sugar until soft. This wasn't a recipe, it was a survival technique disguised as dessert. Take whatever dried fruit you had, add water and sugar, and cook until edible. The dried fruit was usually apples, peaches, or apricots that had been dried months earlier. The drying process concentrated the flavors but also changed the texture permanently. No amount of cooking would return the fruit to its original state. The fruit would be placed in a pot with water and left to soak for several hours or overnight. The fruit would absorb water and swell, but it would remain tough and leathery. Sugar would be added, and the whole mixture would be cooked until the fruit was as soft as it was going to get. The sugar would dissolve into the liquid, creating a sweet syrup. The result was served warm in tin cups or bowls. Cowboys would eat the fruit and drink the syrup, getting whatever nutrition and sweetness they could from the mixture. It wasn't good, but it was different from biscuits and beans. The flavor was intensely concentrated fruit flavor with overwhelming sweetness from the added sugar. The fruit itself would be tough and chewy, requiring significant effort to eat. The fruit would sometimes be served over biscuits, creating a primitive version of shortcake. The biscuits would absorb the sweet syrup and become slightly less terrible. This was considered a special treat. Cowboys would eat stewed fruit and remember what fresh fruit tasted like. The comparison would make them homesick, but they'd eat it anyway because it was the closest thing to real fruit they'd have for months. So there you have it. Trail desserts weren't treats or indulgences. They were barely edible concoctions made from the cheapest ingredients available. Vinegar pies, fried dough, and reconstituted dried fruit were what cowboys called dessert, and they were terrible. But they were better than nothing, and on the sea, trail better than nothing was the best you could hope for. Makes you appreciate modern desserts, doesn't it? Those cowboys would be amazed by what we consider mediocre desserts today. They'd probably cry if they tasted actual cake with frosting or real fruit pie made from fresh ingredients. The trail desserts they endured weren't just bad. They were a daily reminder that life on the frontier was hard, uncomfortable, and offered very few pleasures. Even something as simple as dessert was a struggle.